Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Do-It-Yourself ADA Access Planning. This session is being recorded. While everyone is getting signed in, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and go over some housekeeping items. My name is Angie Sievert, and I'm the Operations Manager and Accessibility Coordinator with Mid-America Arts Alliance. Mid-America Arts Alliance is one of 6 national regional arts organizations. We partner with the National Endowment for the Arts, our 6 state arts agencies, and other funders to strengthen and support artists, cultural organizations, and communities throughout the region and beyond. Our 6 states include Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. It is support from the NEA and our 6 state arts agencies that we were able to bring this webinar to you today. Before we proceed to the topic, I want to go over a few housekeeping items first. If you are not muted, please go ahead and mute yourself. You're more than welcome to either have your video on or off. For accessibility purposes, we do ask for you not to use virtual backgrounds. Closed captioning is also available during this webinar. Please click on the closed caption button located either near the top or the bottom of your screen. You can adjust the size of the text by clicking the arrow next to the start video and select video settings. Click on the accessibility and move the slider to adjust the size of the text. You can also view the closed captioning by clicking on a link that has been added in the chat box. You can adjust the size, color, and font of the text and choose to see English or Spanish captioning here. And you can also scroll through the text. You can ask a question during the webinar by clicking on the chat box. We will be monitoring these questions during the webinar, and we should have time for additional questions at the end. Lastly, we will be utilizing breakout rooms in this meeting. You will automatically be assigned to a breakout room. For those of you that are attending with other people from your organization, you'll be assigned to the same breakout room. If for some reason this does not happen, please leave that breakout room and I will get you placed in the correct room. If during the breakout session you have a question, you can click on the Ask for Help button and someone will be in there shortly to assist you. If you need captioning during the breakout session, please let me know through the chat box and I will have to make sure that option's available to you. Now to start the session, I would like to introduce our presenters for today's topic. Scott Artley is Accessibility Program Director at the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, and Allison Berglund Johnson is a practicing artist and access consultant in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
All right, hi everyone. Again, thank you to Angie and to the Mid-America Arts Alliance for inviting us to present today. So my name is Scott Artley. I use he, him pronouns, but they, them pronouns also feel great to me. I'm a white cisgender man in my mid-30s with a short orange beard. Today I'm wearing blue glasses frames, a gray knit hat, and a red t-shirt under a gray zip-up hoodie. Behind me is my 450 square foot apartment that serves as my home office and my kitchen and my living room and my art studio and my gymnasium, which I don't use it for that last one very often, but it is technically also that. Today I'm going to be presenting my workshop, DIY ADA Access Planning. And if you haven't already downloaded those session materials, I'll encourage you to do it now. You can either get it in that registration email you received earlier or by visiting the link being dropped in the chat. There's a webpage folder where you can download all of those things. Slide deck that I'm going to be presenting today is built with accessibility principles in mind. You'll notice the big blue bar at the bottom is for those nice generous space for those closed captions. And the PDF that was shared in the email of the slide deck is remediated for screen readers. And as I present, I'll be verbally describing all visual elements. All right, so we went over some of these virtual meeting norms, but just to say them again, for accessibility reasons, please turn off any virtual backgrounds. And I will say, if your video is choppy, or if your video or audio is choppy, feel free to turn up your video, but also it's totally okay to have your video off in general. Let's normalize not having our videos on if we don't want to. Keep your microphone muted and feel free to use the chat for questions as we go along. So use that chat as you have thoughts that come up. We'll pause a couple of times for questions and answers throughout. So just know that we are listening and we'll get to them as we can. use that rename function in the upper right-hand corner of your video box if you'd like to add pronouns to your name if desired. And again, we'll be talking about those visual aspects verbally. So here's our agenda for today. We have a 90-minute session. It's going to go by fast, though, as it always does, because time in 2020 and 2021 has new meaning and no meaning at the same time. So we'll start with a little background on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I know a lot of you are aware about what that is, but some of us are coming to it brand new, so let's get us all on the same page. Then we'll address what is access planning, and I'll talk about a general framework for what access planning looks like. I'll pause after this section for questions. So again, use that Q&A feature. We'll talk about it that way. And then finally, we'll dive into the DIY ADA Access Planning workbook that I created for my job as part of our accessibility training series. We'll then go into the super fun interactive part. We'll go into breakout rooms and you'll actually start practicing using this workbook as it relates to your work. If we have time, I'll open up for more questions at the end and we'll wrap up there. 90 minutes, it will go by fast. I am gonna turn off my video just because I find it distracting to see myself while I am presenting, but I will keep my audio on. All right, so let's kick it off with a little bit about the folks presenting this workshop for you today. So on the left is a photo of me wearing gold rimmed glasses. Again, I use he, him pronouns. They, them also feels good. I was born and raised in Minnesota, where I still live, multidisciplinary artist and cultural producer, spent a lifetime in the arts and about 13 years working professionally in the field as a nonprofit staffer and independent consultant. I'm the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council's first accessibility program director, where I help build and run grant programs and do whatever I can to make MRAC and the region's arts community accessible to people with and people without disabilities. We'll also introduce Allison Berglund Johnson, who's partnering with me on this presentation today. Allison, if you want to unmute yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thank you, Scott. I am wearing a pink sweater that is incredibly fluffy today and have blonde hair that is short, curly, but not terrifically so today. I am also white. I am also cisgender. And I, as a practicing artist, have worked a lot with other artists with disabilities, and I am an artist with a disability, working primarily in the mainstream, including with major museums. And it's really, really fun to be able to present today with you, Scott, and I look forward to being a resource.
Excellent. So I asked Allison to join me today because she's also an expert on arts and disability in my region. So she'll be helping facilitate the small group breakouts at the end of the workshop, and we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. If using the chat feature doesn't work for you, I will be available to talk together for a bit after the presentation today. So just know that I do also value your questions if you're not into using the chat feature. All right, so let me tell you about what is MRAC. I was just saying a moment before we got on that I always look through my slide notes. I'm always like, wherever it says Scott, redo the slide notes later, I will got to make sure I get rid of those. And I did just find my Scott, redo these slides later. Anyway, here's my job at the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council. Our mission is to improve arts access for communities in the 7-county metropolitan area through support to artists and organizations. MRAC is an independent 501c3 nonprofit organization funded primarily through state dollars, and we fund activities at the intersection of where arts serve communities. So I wanted to start off with just a general introduction to the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. I don't have a training as a lawyer, but I wanted to give this little introduction or refresher on what it means to have the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it was passed by the United States Congress in 1999 as the nation's first comprehensive civil rights law addressing the needs of people with disabilities, prohibiting discrimination in employment, public services, public accommodations, and telecommunications. Pictured on the right here on this slide is New York Congressman Major Owens, who's a bald Black man with gray hair and a mustache, wearing a suit in front of an American flag. Major Owens was instrumental in ensuring the passage of the ADA by linking it to the 1960s civil rights movement. The ADA contains 5 major sections, which are called titles. Why they're called titles and not sections, I'm not sure, but they are called titles. And these titles govern different areas of access. So those titles are Title 1, Employment, Title 2, Public Services, Title 3, Public Accommodations, Title 4, Telecommunications, and Title 5, Miscellaneous. So cultural organizations are generally covered under Title 3, Public Accommodations, which I bolded in the slide. And public accommodation means private or public businesses providing goods and services to the public, both the spaces in which they provide those goods or services and the actual provision of those services. Basically, if you provide anything to the public, whether or not it's as a private organization or a public institution, you are covered under this title. So next, let's talk about the US legal definition of disability. So under the ADA, an individual is considered a person with a disability if they are first, a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So under this example, I, as a person with type 1 diabetes, I am under the definition of the ADA considered a person with disability because the major impairment that I have, the major life activity that is impaired because of something in my body is that I, as type 1 diabetic, am not able to metabolize food like the rest of the population. So it turns out that's a pretty major life activity. Next, also covered under the ADA is a person who has a history or a record of such impairment. The classic example of this, and I will trigger for cancer here, is that a person who has a history of having a cancer diagnosis, even if their illness is completely resolved, if they have a history of that disease and somebody discriminates based on that history, for example, if they didn't get a promotion because there was a concern that that person might have a recurrence of that disease, that would also be covered under the ADA. And then finally, the third point here is a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment would be covered under the ADA. So even if they don't actually have a disability, if they don't identify as having a disability, and even if they don't actually have a major impairment of life activity, if somebody perceives them to have a disability, that means that they are actually covered under the ADA. So what's radical here is that this definition is not based on a list of specific conditions. So rather than naming specific diseases or functional limitation, the definition of disability under the US legal system unites those who experience ableism, who experience discrimination on the basis of disability. It's really radical. There could have been a lot of factionalizing that happened in various disability communities. And so by saying that we're united by our experience of ableism, I think that's really radical. So next, let's talk about some terms that are related to the ADA. So first, I'll say that the ADA is really focused on reducing barriers. That's really the core philosophy behind how it works. So it works on that principle that the world is by default built inaccessibly, and that people with disabilities deserve accommodations to reduce barriers to equal access. So again, kind of linking to that 1960s civil rights orientation, everyone deserves equal access. The important point here is that identifying and reducing barriers is key to how the Americans with Disabilities Act works. So barriers are classified by the impact on the organization to remove them. So accommodations that are considered relatively simple or that require limited resources and can be achieved on a shorter timeline are termed readily achieved barrier removal or readily achieved barriers. Accommodations requiring a longer timeline to implement and often require a larger investment of resources are termed long-term barrier removal. So it's about how much work that organization would have to do to remove those barriers or how those are classified. So a reasonable accommodation is another term you'll encounter, is a critical component of how the ADA works and how it assures non-discrimination. So reasonable accommodation is any change in the way things are usually done that results in an equal opportunity for an individual with a disability. So an example here is providing a chair for a cashier or providing additional time for a student to take a test. These are examples of reasonable accommodations. And then the second term, undue hardship, is a little bit more complicated. So an entity covered under any of the ADA titles must make a reasonable accommodation to the known physical or mental limitations of a qualified person with a disability unless, here we go, unless it can show that the accommodation would cause an undue hardship on the operation of its business. So undue hardship is determined on a case-by-case basis. In general, a larger employer with greater resources would be expected to make accommodations requiring greater effort or expense than would be required of a smaller employer with fewer resources. So if a particular accommodation would be an undue hardship, the employer must try to identify another accommodation that would not pose so much of a hardship. The key element of undue hardship that is often discussed in the cultural sector is the idea of a fundamental alteration. So that's an accommodation that would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business, and that would be considered an undue hardship. So the example of this that I've seen often, that I've encountered in arts groups, I won't say often, but I have encountered with arts groups that I worked with when I was working as an individual consultant or independent consultant, is arts groups who say that offering the quote unquote distractions of ASL interpretation or an LED captioning system, just for example, would fundamentally alter the artistic and integrity of the piece. So the idea that somebody seeing ASL interpretation might ruin the stage picture, for example. And I say this in sort of this like uh, inflated way, clearly I have some feelings about it, but I do understand, how somebody might arrive at that logically. So the way that I've countered that piece of feedback is that it's unfortunate that a piece that is created without accessibility in mind has already compromised that fundamental integrity of that piece. So this deserves a much larger conversation for another day, which I'd be glad to have. But I just want to just sort of name that the idea of artistic integrity is something that needs to be thought of. Let's zoom out and think more broadly about the social integrity of what art is supposed to do in the first place. These are some fun terms attached to all of this. Obviously all of them are subject to so much interpretation. I think if you take something away from this presentation, it's that the Americans with Disabilities Act is by no stretch of the imagination a cut and dry black and white kind of law, and it really is about interpretation. There is something called an interactive process, which, sorry, I don't have a slide to put those words up, but it's called an interactive process where when somebody requests an accommodation, the entity that receives that request for an accommodation needs to go through this interactive process to figure out if that accommodation is a reasonable accommodation, if it would pose an undue hardship. And so the process of going through that is actually sort of the function that the ADA requires. It doesn't say that this will always be the right solution, this will always be the reasonable accommodation. What it basically says is you have to go through the process to find a solution that's workable for both the person requesting that accommodation and the entity that would provide it. I have lots of feelings about how this is set up, clearly. I have trouble hiding my feelings sometimes. Ask anyone I've ever dated. But I kind of just want to point out that all of this is the law itself might be something that you consider as a component of how decisions are made, because there is also a broader ethical responsibility attached. So then an ADA plan is a word that you might encounter in doing this work. So so what exactly is an ADA plan? How does it relate to the ADA? And very broadly, it describes an organization's plan to comply with the ADA. That's literally all it is. What is your plan to comply with the ADA? Very open-ended requirement. And again, subject to a great deal of interpretation. But for organizations of all kinds, including cultural groups who explicitly serve community, an ADA plan when it's updated frequently, I think is the best legal and ethical defense that the organization is in compliance with the letter of the law and also critically the spirit of the law. Again, the ADA is a set of laws that's about, meeting some really basic baseline requirements. The spirit of the law, though, is that everyone gets equal consideration, equal access. So next, let's talk about what is that actual ADA access planning process. So this is something I wish someone had explained it to me on a really more basic level when I started doing this work. One of my earliest jobs, I think my first job out of college, I was suddenly thrust into, in addition to being in charge of fundraising for the organization, which as like a 22-year-old, I was like, sure, I'll raise $1.5 million. It's fine. I know how to do that for sure. Which I clearly did not. I was also in charge of audience services for this theater, and it was like, okay, and then also the ADA plan is something you're in charge of. And I wish somebody had really explained to me on a basic level what it meant to be in charge of ADA planning, because I was really thrust into doing that work before I understood the basics, which is why I really want to go over them right now. So from here on out, in this entire presentation is sort of how I've figured out how to do this work from working backward. If the backward goal is to have, or not the backward goal, if the final goal is to have an effective ADA access plan, the planning process, to my understanding, should happen in 3 stages. And I've outlined each of these stages in a green box on these subsequent slides. So this first is what I call the accessibility audit stage. So this includes a structured review of the organization and generally includes a physical audit. So I know that not all organizations have their own buildings, especially right now, buildings might not be totally in play where you're at, but just about everyone has a physical place or places where they share their work or create their work, even if it's not active right now, even if it's the house of a board member where meetings take place. Thinking about how physical parameters take place in your work is an important part of this review. But it's also not the only place that you should be considering. There's beyond the physical audit, there's accessibility that are contained in lots of elements of this work. So this next slide includes that first stage of accessibility audit and then adds that second stage, the ADA plan, which is again outlined in green. So during this stage, having identified where someone might encounter barriers to access, the ADA planning stage is about generating solutions and then prioritizing those solutions and then assigning someone to take action, right? So a plan, generate solutions, prioritize those solutions, and then assign action. And then the final stage here, accompanying those accessibility audit and ADA plan green boxes, adds the final green square, which is ADA coordination. So this is where you implement those solutions you've identified as priorities and you oversee the ADA plan, and then you respond to new requests for access accommodations as they come in. And then on a regular basis, you go right back to that first stage and repeat these steps over and over until you're 100% perfectly accessible, which of course I'm being facetious about because you can't be 100% perfectly accessible. It's just not a reality. But even if it's not a reality, it's always this impossible goal in practice that we always need to be shooting for. So one of my goals at my job at MRAC is to train organizations in the region to plan for accessibility. And as I did research about how to do this, I kept finding checklists. Maybe you've encountered such checklists. Checklists abound everywhere you look when you look up accessibility ADA planning. So I found checklists upon checklists made of smaller checklists in a series. What I had trouble finding was finding a checklist that could serve the needs of small cultural organizations that I typically work with. And these small cultural organizations are less likely to have a physical building and less likely to have budgets to afford expensive access services and are more likely to be nimble and creative in a way that checklists didn't always account for. So I created this ADA access planning workbook to be scalable for the vast and varied community of arts groups that MRAC serves. So we serve small volunteer-run cultural organizations with budgets of $500 a year to even mid-sized organizations with budgets of $400,000 a year. And throughout, I've used the same basic process for larger institutions, even with budgets in the millions when I was doing independent consulting. So you'll notice that I also consciously use the combined term ADA access, as in an ADA access plan. So I do this intentionally because some folks really respond to the ethical commitment to inclusion, and some respond to the legal liability that the ADA presents. And this is why I made this conscious choice to pair the two. I know personally on the staff level, I often see that ethical commitment to inclusion, the realism of making sure that you're available to the broadest possible audience as, even a marketing person, that makes a lot of sense. And then sometimes, from a board member's perspective, figuring out where to best place resources, sometimes that means making difficult choices. So the convincing factor for a board member might be the legal liability of not paying attention to the ADA. So that's why I decided to include both of them. I also built this workbook that I will be presenting soon, I swear, in a way to reinforce what I call access thinking, which I mean to say, like, considering the fullness of human abilities and disabilities in everyday choices. Access thinking, fullness of human abilities and disabilities in everyday choices. So when you develop what I call a culture of access, it means your group has cultivated its collective ability to embed access thinking into how you work. So I designed this workbook with the suggestion that a group of people get together to work on it together, and ideally from various levels and perspectives in a group. So senior leadership and frontline workers can both contribute to this plan equally. It's a very flat process in a lot of ways, and it's almost better when you have multiple perspectives coming to it. The real work of this workbook is not filling out the boxes that I'll be presenting soon, but it's really getting on the same page. And that's hard work. And this workbook is the product that represents that real work, which is finding common understanding and facilitating negotiation to make things happen. Planning is hard work, and planning with a goal that can feel nebulous and confusing is even harder work. So this process, I just want to acknowledge that it's not easy. The fact that you've come to this presentation today is already huge and amazing. So you've already made that first step. And I think as you walk away from what we'll be doing today, bringing other people in your organization along with that journey is also hard work. Speaking as a person who lives with disabilities, I appreciate everyone who's made that commitment, because it has made my life so much richer along the way. So last slide before we get to our first question and answer period is just sort of an explanation of how this ADA access planning workbook is structured. And I've built it around what I call categories of access. Which is really just ways of organizing the conceptual work of access planning. So to the right on this slide is a collection of accessibility accommodations icons in blue and white arranged in a square. And then these categories of access are, this list of 5. First, accessibility policies. Second, access planning and resources. Next, physical and architectural access, which so often is the only thing that's covered in a checklist, or is the primary thing you think about when you think about ADA planning. It's intentional that I put it third in this list. And then next is communications and outreach. And then finally, accessible programs and services. So again, these are just conceptual buckets in which you can think about all of the ways that access might show up in your organization. And that's the way that I've structured this workbook. So with that, I'd love to invite any questions that have come up in the chat thus far about the ADA, titles of the ADA, the definition of disability and any of those terms related to the ADA, and sort of broad strokes, the ADA access planning process. After we answer some questions, I will invite you on a little experiment that I'm calling the brain stretch. So with that, Allison, if there are any questions in the chat, be happy to answer.
Scott, at this time, there are no questions in the chat.
I'm doing too excellent of a job. This is a problem. So I will pause. I will embrace a moment of silence as a productive space. If there are any questions, feel free to take a moment and put them into the chat. All right, hearing that there are no questions, if that's still the case, I'm going to lead us in this little experiment. It'll just take us about a minute. I'm calling it the brain stretch. Of course, feel free to use this moment however you wish. It's going to be about a minute. I just think it's important to put some stretches in here. I invite you to participate, though, if you'd like. I usually say, all right, let's take a quick stretch break. And I wanted to think of a way to include a stretch break that was maybe more inclusive of all abilities. So I'm going to turn my video back on, but this might be a smart moment for you to turn off your camera if you would rather do that. And I invite you also to close your eyes if that feels good. So in this brain stretch moment, we're just using a moment to step away from what's happening content-wise on the screen and just sort of consider ourselves in an environment. So again, turn off your camera, close your eyes if that feels good to you, keep them open, all's good. And I want you to just consider what's to your left. So I want you to stretch your mind in that direction. And if it feels good, stretch your body in that direction. I am just gonna stretch my arm out a little bit. I have a kind of inflammatory arthritis. It's an autoimmune disorder. So my body does not like me sitting in one place for very long. So I'm going to just consider what's to my left and move my body in that position. And I'm considering what's in the room. So to the left of me is my couch and my cat taking a nap. What's outside of this room, thinking what's in your community to the left, what's in the geography around you to the left. And I want you to do the same on the right side. So I'm going to, again, extend my arm to the right. There's a bookshelf in the way. Thinking about the apartment that's to the right of my arm. The restaurant that's down the street to the right, the Mississippi River that's even further and further down to the right. And then we're going to do the same about what's above you. So I'm going to just consider and I'm going to stretch my neck as I do it, consider the ceiling above me. There's no apartments above me, so it's just sky from here on out, trees. And I'm going to do the same as I think about what's below me. I'm on the 3rd floor. I'm going to stretch out my feet. And below me are 2 levels of apartments, down to the dirt, soil, all the way down to the core of the earth. It's a quick move down. And then I'm gonna just feel myself existing in all those directions at once, so shake it out if that feels good. A little stretch. And then if you want to return your mind back to where you are now. I feel more centered. That feels great.
Scott, we have a few questions. Do we have time for them now?
Yes, we do.
Lovely. So the first question, there's one I've bookmarked for the end, but there's 2 for now. Juliana Wisman says, you mentioned a frustration about the interactive process. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, so to be clear, my frustration is not with the interactive process. I think that's actually what works great about the ADA is that it requires us to have a conversation. I think that maybe the sort of feelings that I was referencing was that the way that the ADA is set up is that the onus, the responsibility of that interactive process starting is on the person who faces a barrier to access, right? So that person who says, I actually can't get in your front door, or I can't participate in your activity, they're the ones who have to start that process and say, hey, I've encountered a barrier and I need to do the work. I need to ask you to do the work to help alleviate that barrier, to remove that barrier. And the reality is the power dynamics of asking for something like that is really challenging. It's really unfair. I mean, you're thinking about, one one patron trying to participate in something versus an entire institution, that power imbalance is I think, at the core of what makes me feel gross about that. In a perfect world, there would be no need for an interactive process because everyone will have perfectly been able to access something. So when I say that I have feelings about that, that's sort of where that comes from.
Thank you. Sorry, I just noticed I had my mic on and I was typing, so sorry. The remaining question is asking by Jonathan Hash for insight into service animal discrepancies, and wording for it would be nice.
I don't know that I fully understand this question. I invite you to unmute yourself if that works for you and maybe clarify, or if Allison, if you have any thoughts, that would be useful.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Jonathan.
I was just curious if you had any thoughts on how to approach like issues you might have with visitors coming in to a museum with various animals. I know if they're service animals, they must be let in, but there's certain like questions and things that you can ask and others that you can't. Just a general overview, basically, because
Sure.
sometimes it becomes an issue.
Yeah, I think, so thank you for clarifying that. I think I understand your question to be about the difference between service animals, which are specifically named in the ADA guidelines about those animals who are, who have specific training to assist with major life tasks that a person with disability might be unable to or have great difficulty completing without that animal, versus companion animals, or comfort animals, which is sort of various nebulous terms that are used for animals who provide services that are not specifically named in the ADA guidelines. It's sort of beyond, I don't have those notes specifically in front of me about what questions you're allowed to ask. To my recollection, don't quote me on this, but I definitely encourage you to look it up. I'm pretty sure that the only two questions you're allowed to ask are, is this a service animal? And what tasks is the service animal providing you with? And I think that's all you're able to say. There is no, to my current knowledge, there is no like certification process for service animals. Folks presenting certificates or whatever, like that's cool that they do that, but I don't think that's actually a real thing. Although there are lots of reasons for certificates. So I'm not an attorney. I feel like I probably should have said this way at the front of this, but like, I'm not an attorney. I'm not a legal expert. My expertise is in working with small and mid-sized and larger arts organizations on how to plan for access, and not on the legal elements of it. But that is an issue. And yeah, there's lots of discussion around that. I would say as it pertains to this ADA access planning process, the DIY part of it would be, looking that up. There are definite guidelines around that. But then I would also say that there's plenty of conversation that I've seen online about, how to handle that process in a way that feels dignified for the person and the people involved. And yeah, I would say thinking about the way that your organization might consider what those policies are. Again, the ADA is a baseline guideline. It's the floor at which everyone should be working from. You should always be stretching toward that ceiling of 100%, that ceiling that is the endless sky of 100% access. And so having that conversation about what are our sort of ethical commitments, what are our moral needs around providing access, and what does that look like in balance with the realities of our organization and what we can do. A total non-animal related version of this is I worked with an outdoor sculpture garden once who I, at the time, like I said, I have an autoimmune arthritis. And it means that I have troubles walking sometimes, and I've used my bike a lot as a way to get around. And I was told that bikes were actually not allowed in the sculpture garden. I said, well, hey, this is like a really critical mobility aid for me. And they said, like, I understand that. And also the pathways that we have currently that we're able to afford to maintain are destroyed by bikes. So we actually, we have that reasoning for not including it. So that was an example of sort of balancing the why and the how. And they also had a long-term plan to do asphalt paving that would make it allowable for bikes to participate. So I feel like that was a very long answer, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
We might have time for maybe one more question if there are any.
Okay, great. I want to share on that a bit that there's been some conversation in the chat regarding certification programs, noting that they do exist. I noted that there's not really a process under the ADA, under the law itself, regarding what certification might be, other than the language around trained for a task. And people are just sharing experiences on that. There's a link to an organization about service animals, so that looks great. There is a larger question that I was going to save till the end, but I'll ask it now, and if you want to bookmark it, that's fine too.
Okay.
Jen Gardner from Diverse Works says, I'm curious how your work might relate to the current disability justice movement and intersectional social justice issues.
Oh, Jen, let's be best friends, because I 100% had in my notes, like, okay, and here's where I present my 18 slides about disability justice. And I, just for the sake of time, unfortunately did not get to include that. Let's definitely talk about that at the end. I appreciate this question so much. And yes, intersectional access, disability justice, so critical, so important. You're not doing access unless you're doing intersectional access. With that, I am going to move us along to our next spot just so we can keep moving. I'm going to turn off my video again and let's move along. All right, so if you have the workbook available, now would be a great time to bring it out so we can talk about it. The workbook itself kicks off on page 1 with accessibility policies, again, that first category of access. For larger or more mature organizations, there may be existing policies in place and likely established processes and even procedures written down, which is amazing. But for smaller, younger organizations, I would look at policies as the place to start, actually. So easy to feel like you can jump into action, but I think policies are really important to think about, because when an issue or opportunity arises related to access and you're not sure how to respond, this policy will help guide your actions. I provided a sample policy in the workbook, but I encourage you to revise as necessary so that the leaders involved in your group really feel excited about doing this work. If they can't be bought into that policy, that's all a whole lot of work to zoom back to. So on this first page, policies, processes, and procedures, I want you to consider the sample non-discrimination access policies and then reflect on those remaining sections of this page. Be realistic about what's happening now. If you plan to make changes, note them here. So these other sections ask you to make explicit how you arrived at this plan and how the complicated dynamics of power and permission play into this work and how you'll handle incoming requests and grievances. So you'll be surprised about how many mature organizations actually haven't completed that really fundamental step of having had these conversations explicitly. There might be procedures in place, but maybe you haven't talked about the why. I think it's a really important foundation on which the rest of that work you will do stands. So pages 2 through 5 of that workbook will take you through the planning process according to those remaining categories of access. I really consider this sort of the audit part of that planning process. So that first green box that we looked at in the slide. So on each of these pages, you'll have conversations that go through the first 2 stages of the access planning process. And those first 2 green boxes from a few slides ago. So that accessibility audit and generating an ADA plan. It's really combined into these pages. So in completing that workbook, for each page, read the prompting questions for each category. They ask you a question, you answer them. Reflect on whether or not your organization does these things that are asked in the prompting questions. If you are doing those things, celebrate them. Celebrate and document them in that section called current efforts. I feel like so much of my work as an independent consultant in Access was letting organizations feel good about the stuff that they're already doing. So often with Access, it feels like there's all you can feel is those places where there are pain points, where you don't feel like you're doing enough. And I think it's really important to celebrate what you are doing. So that's why I've included this section, current efforts. If you're not doing those things, however, I want you to reflect on how that presents a barrier to a person, or could present a barrier, and then document that in the section called known barriers. And that's really what this workbook is just going through that process over and over. I have this section all about identifying barriers. There's a separate supplemental piece called identifying barriers and setting goals. It's another sheet outside of the workbook itself that might be useful to you. I just want to note that filling out this known barriers section, it might be hard, but it is a key part of how you develop that access thinking. So that supplemental tool is a way to help you do that. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but as you're working on this workbook in the small group sections, I encourage you to take a look at that supplemental piece called identifying barriers and setting goals. I also want to acknowledge how this tool is inspired by and adapted from Upstream Arts' Smile Network, so these identifying barriers. Upstream Arts, their logo is shown on this slide. It's a spiral in purple in front of blue scribbles and a circle with the text Upstream Arts to the right. Upstream Arts is this fabulous organization based in Minneapolis. Their mission is to use the power of the creative arts to activate and amplify the voice and choice of individuals with disabilities. And their SMILE framework helped inspire some of this way that I think about identifying barriers. So those barriers include sensory experience. This slide includes an illustration of a person with their brain highlighted, surrounded by icons of various senses. So sensory experience, seeing activities, hearing activities, fragrance and chemical allergies, sensory processing disorders, also known as overstimulation, and mental health or social concerns. Again, I'm going to fly through these just for the sake of time. Mobility, so barriers related to mobility, site location, transportation and travel, getting to a building entrance, exterior or interior doorways, exterior or interior pathways, including the distance of travel, navigation, wayfinding, accessing different levels via steps, steep inclines, counter or window height, restroom access, emergency evacuation, or bringing service animals. On this slide, it includes that modern symbol of accessibility, an active figure using a wheelchair. Next, identifying barriers related to communication. So how might participants face barriers related to communication, being able to access content in a preferred way, requesting assistance or accommodation in a preferred format, having a clear way to learn about the organization's offerings and the accessibility of particular projects. This slide has two silhouetted figures in profile with speech bubbles of various sizes and colors between them. So on the communication front, I'll just emphasize this is about the ways that folks communicate with you about the work that you create, not necessarily about the work that you create, which will come up in a later section. Next, identifying barriers related to knowledge. There's a complicated image to the right. It's a meme that you might be seeing going around called Galaxy Brain. And in this meme, there's partially awakened brain that says making accommodations when requested, then a more awakened brain that says anticipating potential access considerations, and then the so-called galaxy brain with rays of awakening stretching beyond the brain at embracing a culture of access. So that's just part of that galaxy brain meme talking about the ways that you embrace a culture of access. So identifying barriers related to knowledge includes identifying ways that a lack of awareness, skills, or expertise by leaders might present a barrier, or others' assumptions about how someone can or cannot participate, about knowing what to expect, how a participant might know what to expect in participating with your organization's work, or understanding how to participate in that work, or an awareness of the services offered or the choices one could make about how to participate, or how they might ask for assistance or accommodations. All those things are knowledge barriers. So that was really quick, but those are the ways you might identify barriers. So in completing the workbook, those next steps in that ADA planning process is to consider each known barrier and then develop a SMART goal to address them. So I'll ask you to refer back to those prompting questions as a way to think about possible solutions. It might be saying, oh, wow, I'm realizing that I can't do something, might actually present the solution for how you can do something. So then you would want to decide whether these goals are short-term goals or long-term goals. And there's a section in these workbooks that ask you to categorize them according to short-term goals or long-term goals. Um, I've given these these general parameters of like a short-term goal is like anytime, from 3 to 18 months, and a long-term goal might be 18 to 36 months. Really, it's going to depend on what your organization's planning cycles look like. Again, a younger, smaller organization might just have a much faster planning cycle. And that means a long-term goal for you might be a year and a half away rather than 5 years away. I'm going to skip over this bit about SMART goals. It's also in that supplement about how to make a great goal, but basically making them specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound are really what make great goals. And then prioritizing goals. So the ADA guidelines has some very specific ideas about how you should prioritize your accessibility goals. So these priorities are priority one, and again, this is according to the ADA guidelines. Priority one is accessible entrance into the facility. Can't participate if you can't get in. The second priority is access to goods and services. So what are the actual things that you provide? How do you provide access to them? The third third priority according to the ADA is access to restrooms. So once you're inside of the theater and you've been able to you're able to see or participate in the theater production being presented, can you also pee while you're there? Pretty critical. That's why it's the third priority. And then fourth priority is any other measures necessary. A nice vague statement, much like much of the ADA. So here's what I actually think. So recognizing that smaller cultural groups might want to think differently about prioritization, here's my suggestion based on what I've done over the years. So my first suggestion for your priority is, what is your community already asking you to address? If you already have folks who have made it to participating with you, have indicated an interest, want to make something happen, but are identifying issues, maybe think about prioritizing those issues first. Second priority, who have you been trying to engage and what barriers do they face? So if you're looking at those known barriers and saying, well, we know that this barrier in particular is a barrier to a community that we've been working really hard to engage, probably makes sense to prioritize that, addressing that as a priority to help you accomplish your work. The third priority, what other strategies can you readily achieve without major resources? So thinking about the ways that, what are those things that feel like, I call them cheap, free, and easy strategies. So what are those things that, even if they're not going to make an enormous impact, they might be ones that feel like you could actually just make them happen without it being too hard. What are those readily achievable barriers that feel like doable in a way that feels like an accomplishment? Again, you don't want to rest on the laurels of having done only those readily achievable barriers or address those readily achievable barriers. But it does, there's something to be said about accomplishing something and being able to see some progress made. So those are my suggestions on what prioritizing goals might look like. So this next step on completing the workbook is the coordination element. So that third green box in the access planning process. And this step is really this is still in the second side. So second green box. So assigning next steps to a specific person. So looking at those long and short-term goals that you've put into these boxes, I want you to think about assigning those to a specific person. If it feels like some steps that feel really understandable, you know what to take, that's great, assign a specific person to it. But say that something feels like, whoa, that's like a lot, like, putting in an elevator, that takes a lot of coordination. That'll be a lot of work. We don't even know if it's feasible to do that. Well, then maybe your first step is actually feasibility study to determine if installing an elevator is possible. So break those bigger goals into smaller goals that make them feel more accomplishable. It's the only way we get work done. I know that I'm preaching to a choir of a bunch of people in a room who are so good at making stuff happen. I'm sure you know how to make really great goals and how to make them happen. So I just want to show you a sample plan so you can look at what it could look like in practice. So let me pull up. And now I cannot find it. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second and see if I can pull this up. There we go. All right. So here's a sample example of a filled out page. So this is from the page 3 of 5, physical and architectural access. So in a moment when we break into these groups, I'm going to have you select a page to work with. This one might seem really easy because it's like, oh, we really understand physical and architectural access. That seems like one that a lot of folks intuitively understand what physical access looks like. I actually won't suggest that you start there, partially because not everyone really has a great grasp on what physical and architectural access actually means, or the steps to take there. That's going to feel like a lot to do in 30 minutes, the amount of time that we have available to do this. So I'm just presenting this as because I feel like it's the most understandable, but it's not necessarily the easiest one to kick it off with. So looking at these prompting questions, this first question is about, has there been a recent physical audit of the spaces used? So in my Acme organization that I've made up in my head, they have done a physical audit, and you can see this in their current efforts. They've done a physical audit of their home performance space, including audience and performer areas, which was conducted in September 2019. The venue continues to be our home base in part because it meets all basic ADA architectural guidelines. Amazing. And then the second question, what is the relationship of the organization to space? So this organization, Acme organization, says we rent a theater for each of our 3 annual productions. We have a long-term relationship with the venue and plan to continue offering productions only in this space. The venue is centrally located and is close to public transit. And then this third prompting question, what solutions are available to address barriers? And then there's a list of ways that you might consider the areas in which there might be barriers. So current efforts include, we're in conversation with the venue about partnering to raise funds to make an accessible restroom backstage for performers. In answering all of these questions above, they've also identified these known barriers. It's an older building with possible allergen triggers. Building entrance and layout is confusing to audiences. And there's a backstage restroom for performers that is up a flight of stairs, which the barrier is that folks can't get up those stairs possibly. So they've spent a moment celebrating those current efforts. They've also known where there's still some improvement to be made. So looking at each of these areas of known barriers, they've also identified some short-term and some long-term goals. And I've really made that really clearly, looking at possible allergen triggers as this first issue. So their first goal related to that is add allergen trigger warning to website and ticketing process before the first show in our next season. They've assigned that to Grace. Second, about the building entrance and, this is still related to possible allergen triggers. So start conversation with the venue about mold remediation during contract negotiation, which Mohammed would be in charge of doing. And then addressing that barrier about building entrance and layout being confusing. The next short-term goal is by August 2021, create a video explaining where to park, find the entrances, including accessible routes, engage additional ushers to help guide audiences while inside, which Grace is also doing. Grace wears many hats, clearly. And then the backstage restroom issue, so raise funds, a short-term goal, raise funds so that our home venue has an accessible restroom backstage, connect the venue to performers impacted by this issue for their recommendations, which Jane will be doing. And then long-term goals, address allergen triggers through mold remediation and HVAC improvements. Jane will be working with the venue on that. And then possibly explore alternative venues or what it would mean to participate in a capital campaign with the venue, which the board committee will work on. This is an example of a filled out page. I actually think this is a really robust plan. It could even be shorter. There could be less stuff on here. The fact of it happening is the key part. I'm sorry, I'm just realizing that some of these things are flashing. So I'm going to be done with this share and we're going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation. So what happens after you've worked through this plan? you could consider making what I call a cleaner and clearer version of what you developed in this worksheet. A lot of folks just start handwriting, and it might be nice to just come back and make it look nicer. But if you have a handwritten version and that's what you have time to do, that's totally fine. The fact that you've done it is what's amazing. So from there, you'd want to approve with the board of directors or advisory committee, and then note that date of approval at the top, the very top of the workbook. And then critically revisit. So the access coordinator should make sure that is a role that should make sure the organization is revisiting this plan on a regular basis. This person probably shouldn't be the only one executing what's in this plan. At minimum, the access coordinator is tasked with reminding the organization about the plan to ensure it's being acted on. Whenever I see an access coordinator who's in charge of actually also executing the whole plan, it's not sustainable. So thinking about the ways that it might be revisited becomes a standing agenda on board meetings. Maybe it's part of the first production meeting for every project. Whatever it looks like for your organization to be able to keep revisiting, that's what's important. Typically, this looks like a board meeting that, once a year, it's revised with the board of directors. And then finally, revising. After you revisit, make sure that you revise, lather, rinse, repeat ADA planning until constantly 100% accessible, which of course is impossible. So if you complete the goal, please celebrate it. Make notes for when you want to revise the plan next to say, these are now part of our current efforts. If you're having trouble completing the goal, think about what's stalling the progress. Think about adjusting the goal. And then while you revisit the plan regularly throughout the year to ensure planned activities are taking place, it's usually revised entirely every 1 to 3 years to reflect changes in the organization and its need. So because I'm too talkative, I'm gonna have us actually just move to breakouts, I think. But here's what we just talked about. And if you have questions along the way, Allison and I will be coming in and out of these groups to answer questions, to help you along, even just to say hi. So what we just talked about was identifying barriers, developing goals and prioritizing those goals, then executing, revisiting, and revising, or ADA coordination. We're going to be splitting into breakouts now. So if you came with coworkers or collaborators, we're making every effort to get you in one room together with your collaborators. If you came independently, meaning without your coworkers or collaborators, we're going to put you into groups relatively randomly with groups that are there with coworkers. So essentially be working on one organization together. So what we'll ask you to do is select a section to begin. Again, my suggestion is to start with communications or outreach or programs and services. Those I think are maybe sort of easier to start practicing. And then thinking about, make a decision about whether you'll be working on answering this worksheet for your whole organization or just for a specific project or program, depending on the size of your organization or scope. That might be, that's a good decision to make upfront. And then you'll just go through that process, identifying looking at those prompting questions, identifying current efforts, your barriers, and then your short and long-term goals. So what you get through today is what you get through today. It's the right amount. It's what you were always meant to get through today. So we're working new muscles, however long it takes, whatever you get through, that's what you're meant to do today. Allison and I will be available for questions or other help. So again, when you're in those breakout rooms, just hit that button, say we need some help, and we'll also just be floating around to say hi. So if we come into your room suddenly, we're not here to scold you or anything. We're here to help and talk you through things. We'll have about, let's say like 20-ish minutes to get through this. So you will not make a huge dent, but you're going to get started on that's what's important. And I will hand it over to Angie to talk through any of those logistics.